Hello there, I'm back. So this is Dr. Michael Batu, and for this video we're going to continue with our output and prices in the short run. This is the third part, and for this video we're going to look at the effects of an aggregate supply shock. An aggregate supply shock is this, it can be shown graphically as the shift of the entire aggregate supply curve. Now, what triggers an aggregate supply shock? A classic trigger of an aggregate supply shock are input prices. So let's assume that there's an increase in input prices. So for instance, let's say price of oil. Okay, so the price of oil has gone up, and what happens there is that this will have a direct impact on the firm, meaning that the cost of production should go up. When cost of production goes up, well, what happens to our aggregate supply curve? Our aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, and let me show that here in the graph. So our AS curve will shift to the left from AS1 to AS, so from AS1 to AS2. Okay, so now we have a new short-run equilibrium right here, and let's call this guy Y2 and the new price level P2. Notice that the new short-run equilibrium is to the left of Y star, which means that we have a recessionary gap. Okay, so this results to increase in prices, lower output, okay, and we have a recessionary gap. Now, when there's a recessionary gap, what happens is the following. There are resources in the economy that are not being used to its full potential, to its capacity. For example, there might be workers that are laid off. So you have workers out there that are looking for work. And what happens there is that when in the labor market, when there are more workers looking for work than demand, what happens is that there is a pressure for wages to decrease. Okay, or for instance, input prices. When that happens, cost of production decreases. And when cost of production decreases, our aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, and it will shift to the right until the recessionary gap is gone. Is gone. There you go, with an exclamation. So let me do a recap here. So increase in input prices, increase in cost of production, AS curve shifts to the right. Oh, sorry, it shifts to the left, right here. Okay, let me call this number 1 right here. Okay, aggregate price level increases, output decreases relative to Y star, we have a recessionary gap. Recessionary gap, we have resources in the economy or inputs in the economy that are not being used fully. Workers, for example, when there are more workers looking for jobs than demand, what happens in the labor market is that wage falls. Cost of production decreases, and your AS curve will shift to the right. So it will shift again to the right, and I will call this number 2 right here until this recessionary gap is gone. So what happens here is that all the action that's going on here is just with the aggregate supply curve. There's no action going on the demand side. See, the demand curve didn't shift. All the action happens with aggregate supply curve. And there you have it. So this is the third part of this video. I hope you like it, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you. Hi, I'm back. This is Dr. Michael Batu, and today we're going to talk about national output and value added. So the way production happens in the economy is that it happens in stages. So before we have final goods, we have what we call intermediate goods. So final goods are goods that are not used anymore for further production. In contrast, intermediate goods are goods that are used for further production. This distinction is important if we are to compute national output using value added. So let me write some concepts first in order for you to understand what I'm saying. All right, so these are the definitions of intermediate and final goods and value added. So when we say intermediate goods, these are outputs used as inputs by other producers in further stage of production. Final goods, on the other hand, are goods not used as inputs for further production, but instead they are meant to be sold. Now, how do we compute value added in the economy? So value added is computed but using the following approach. What we do is that we compute the value of the firm's output minus the value of the inputs purchased from other firms. So that is for one firm, all right? So what we're doing here is that we're computing value added for one firm. Now, in order to compute the value added for the whole economy is that you just have to compute the value added for each firm and add them up. That's how it's done. But for this case, what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at an example of one firm. All right, so here I have an example of a firm where we have information on the revenue and the inputs that are used and the value of the inputs used by this firm. And what we're going to do is we're going to compute for the value added for this firm. So let's read the problem first and let's analyze the given. So Batu's Bakery generates a yearly revenue of $6,000. Throughout the year, Batu spends $1,500 on flour, $1,000 on fruit, $500 on sugar and spices, $1,500 in butter, and employs an assistant whom Batu pays $1,000. So calculate the value of annual output using the value added method. So remember the definition earlier of value added. It's the difference between the value of goods and services produced by that firm, okay, which in this case is yearly revenue, minus the value of intermediate goods. So let's do that. So let's start with the yearly revenue. Here we have 6,000. So what we're going to do is the following. We're going to subtract from 6,000. So we have here 6,000. We're going to subtract, number one, the expenditure on flour, right here. So we're going to subtract 1,500. Remember, this 1,500 is an intermediate input, flour. Next, we're going to subtract the value of another intermediate input, fruit. Okay. Next, we're going to subtract another intermediate good, or the value of an intermediate good, which in this case is, so we have here 1,000 for fruit. Here you have 500 for sugar and spices. And since this is a bakery, Batu uses butter, so we have to subtract the value of the intermediate good, butter, 1,500. Then here you have butter. All right. So what's left? So what's left is 1,500, because you have here 1,500, 4,500. Yeah, so 15, that's right. So you have here left 1,500. So this, my friends, is the value added. Now the question is this: why didn't we include the cost of the assistant? And the reason is the following. Of all the intermediate goods, this one is actually labor. This is not an intermediate good. So in other words, the firm, which is in this case Batu's Bakery, purchased the hours of the worker, which is not considered as an intermediate input. In contrast, these goods, flour, fruit, sugar, and spice, and butter, these are goods that were produced by another firm. And these are the goods that, the value of these intermediate goods that we have to take into account when computing value added. So in other words, we will not include, for this particular example, we will not include the cost of labor, which is $1,000. So to summarize, the value added for Batu's Bakery is worth $1,500. And that concludes our video on computing value added. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.